I appreciate the opportunity to be in Vermont once again. I come here at least once or twice a year, maybe 3, 4. And this time I'm coming as a moderator, I guess. So I'm Troy Bishopp. I live in Central New York. I have a custom grazing operation. I'm also the new Eastern Region representative for the National Grazing Lands Coalition. So if you need free grazing charts, they're right over here. I'm the grazing chart guy. This topic is something that's needed to try to figure out if everybody wants to bale graze for whatever reasons that you all have. We're going to take a stab at the practical side of it, the perspective side. So when we start to talk about implementation, the pros, the cons, lessons learned, we're going to delve into all that. So I have a cheat sheet that I came up with to get this conversation starting, and then you're the customer. So I'll assume that you have lots of questions, and I'm sure we'll be talking about waste, hay. We're going to talk about animal welfare. We'll probably talk about the Vermont NRCS grazing payment, bale grazing payment that may or may not be happening. I keep hearing that it's happening, all the nuances of fencing, infrastructure, where you put the bales, how do you do it, all that kind of stuff. In my context, on my farm, I have done pretty much everything that we're going to talk about to some degree of difficulty. And usually it has to do with mud and it has to do with placement. And when you're a contract grazer, I have to deal with square bales, not round bales sometimes. I have to deal with baleage, square bale baleage or round bale baleage, feeders, hay feeders, massive amounts of snow, my own risk aversion, animal welfare. Then once all that creative winter feeding happens, what do you do afterward? So I don't have any equipment that's worth much other than the 1950s additions of tools that I have from my great grandfather. That's all I have at this point. Renovating. There's a lot of talk about leaving it, just leaving these big mounds of hay. I put chickens on hay rings that they love it, but I got a lot of rings and not many chickens. There's a whole litany of experiences of planning to do it, doing it, cleaning up afterward, and then the future, what are you trying to achieve? We're going to try to cover a ton of things. So right off the bat, again, part of my cheat sheet, I want to introduce Josh, Amber, and Matt, and I'd like for them to explain their operation in the context in which they farm. Then you all have your own context, I'm pretty sure of that. And we'll delve into some of these questions. And then I feel like you're free to take questions, right? So if it gets too long, I'm going to cut you off so we can get to the next. We only have so much time. I'll be the bad guy.
My name is Josh Lucas from Lucas Cattle Company and Lucas Family Farms, based in Orwell, so southern Champlain Valley, otherwise known as the Banana Belt in the wintertime. We deal with a lot of 30-degree weather year-round, all through the winter. So we deal 100% clay soil, 0 gravel, no high dry ground at all. Bale grazing at scale, primarily with the cow-calf operation, more specifically the dry pregnant beef cows. And so those groups will average from 70 to 150 head in a group, depending on the year. Bale grazing, just as general, the operation is cow-calf, stocker operation, grass-fed finishing, and also some pastured laying hens. Primarily a grazing operation. So we graze that herd of, when I say cows, mama cows. So anyways, those cows winter graze. So we'll graze them into January, February. We use bale grazing to get us through till green grass. And done it for 20 years probably. And so we've done a little bit of everything, and it's never the same. That's the saying, it depends, is nothing truer than that for bale grazing. That's where we are at. I do not use it like feeder cattle and the growing stock. Bale grazing is, the elements seem to take away any gains, so they do a lot better in a lot. So that's kind of where I am. So hog the mic.
Thanks. I'm Amber Reed. I have a little sheep farm in Barnet, Vermont, which is the other banana belt of the state on the Connecticut. We only have about like 70 animals and the lambs are there, so it's pretty small, but I probably spent more time raising like 80 to 90 at the farm that I managed before that, and then 300 or more cows in Colorado, also Bale Grazing there. So I got to see different types of Bale Grazing in different climates. And like you said, every time you do it is different. Every set of animals is different, has their own kind of the easy part and the hard part about that type of Bale Grazing.
Hi, so I'm Matt Garcia. I run Taste for Good Farm. It's in Thetford. Is that a banana belt?
Totally.
Yes, it's 1 mile from the Connecticut River, and I'm on a downslope facing north in Thetford. And that means that I have a lot of wetness on my farm, which I can get into. I do primarily grass-fed beef, and I've had as many as 20 head, and I was supplying a Crossroad farm stand in Norwich, and this mill, I supplied them, and the food shelf in Thetford. In late 2023, I broke my hand, had reconstructive surgery, and I really had a kind of come to Jesus moment about what I was doing. I'm also a professor at Dartmouth. And so my farming habit was jeopardizing my primary source of income. So I went from 20 head to 7 head, 4 sheep, and I'm now just homesteading and living and farming within my means. Thank you.
The next set of questioning is, why are you Bale Grazing? How does it fit in your yearly farm grazing plan? How do you know which field you're going to use? What are the constraints that you're facing in Vermont? And if you could shed a little light on that decision of Bale Grazing versus daily feed cost. Is there a correlation like, boy, I really save money by doing this practice?
Actually,
That's a lot of questions.
it's a lot of questions.
I mean, it's a multi-question line.
Yeah, so there's gonna be no more questions.
Okay, moderator, all right, a couple of those, and then we'll circle back.
I'll just start with the big one of why Bale Graze. In my mind, a lot of the land that we've taken over was basically neglected old hay farms and have been since perimeter fenced and put in divider fences and moved into daily intensive grazing through the grazing season, all of which highly depleted nutrition wise, very little nutrients. The primary reason for me originally was hauling in fertility to pasture land. It's a really good way to get high amounts of fertility hauled out onto your pasture in the off season. That being both the fertility from the manure and urine, but also the refusals left over. And what I found after that is that then feeds the underground livestock. We had very little earthworm activity on our properties until after. Bale grazing kind of lit that on fire. So when you dig underneath where there was a bale, you find nothing but earthworms for years. And it turns that light brown clay into dark black chocolate underneath. So that's the main why. So right there, there's 5 soil plugs there, believe it or not. The one on the far left is a plug. It just didn't stay together. Going left to right, left is an organic cornfield. This is all like May 30th, all taken within 500 yards of each other at a 3-way crossing in the property corners. And then the second from the left with the marks all over it, that is a commodity cornfield where we could those marks are from where I was whacking it with a spade shovel and it wouldn't break apart. It was so compacted. The center one I think is the most interesting. That is a piece that's left in quote unquote conservation. The next one is just management intensive grazing. That's the second from the right. And the far right is where we bale grazed 2 years prior. Yeah. So and this is literally all within 500 yards of each other in a radius. The exact same soil, same slopes, same rain, everything. This is the difference. When we dug those plugs, that was like obviously we did a little trespassing too, by the way, to get it's all good. We don't want to name names. But anyways, so the proof was in the pudding right there in that picture. As far as I'm concerned. So that was the main why of getting that soil biology going and priming that system. We also use it for brush control. That's my newest thing. So that slope is, you can hardly walk up it. It's so steep. That's all raspberry bushes, thorny, nasty stuff that anything but a rabbit can't go through pretty much. So we started unrolling a bunch of like really low quality hay down over it. And that was a week later. And that was 4 or 5 years ago. it needed to be done again, and I didn't do it this winter, but haven't had the right class of livestock on that property to follow up, but we'll do it again. Anyways, and our place has a lot of woody brush species trying to creep in all the time. Multiple rose bushes, buckthorn, all that nasty, miserable undergrowth. And I now take a round bale and just drop it on top of that stuff. And that's where we go, graze. Along fence lines, like the brush is trying to creep in where we cleared it back 10 years ago and built the perimeter fences. Now we're just putting hay down the edge of the fences and let the cattle stomp all that while it's frozen in the wintertime. So that's some of the whys. The major constraint for me is getting the bales set while the ground is hard. So that either means doing it in the fall when it's dry or waiting till the ground is really frozen. That's where most of the compaction comes from, is actually the equipment moving to get it out. It reduces labor and equipment use significantly. We're basically just feeding cows on pasture, right? Like at the end of the day, we're feeding the cattle anyways, we're just feeding them out on pasture. But we can now haul feed out with wagons, 12, 13, 14 bales at a time, versus if we were just feeding daily feeding, you'd probably using a tractor and hauling 2 bales at a time and driving back and forth. So there's some efficiencies that come with it. You can put 3 weeks worth of hay out in an afternoon and then just move wires, remove cows, those sort of things are big. Daily feed costs on a dry pregnant beef cow, 1,200 pound cow eating 3% of her body weight. She's going to use, if I hit 800 pound bales, $35, she's going to be about $1.70 a day to feed. It's not expensive, and that's with leaving waste. That's my main whys of why I'm still doing it.
I'm just gonna go back a little bit here. I think it's one thing that's good for my relationship at home. We were just joking about this at lunchtime. Like, my farm business doesn't own any equipment on the farm. My husband is a contracting business that owns the equipment, and he makes me pay him for when we use the equipment on the farm, which is actually really good because it's forced me to think about when not to use equipment. And so one of the things that we do is we time it and set all the bales out for the entire winter when it's dry in October. And then we try not to start the tractor again until the sheep are basically sheared, because that's the point where they have access to the barn. So when they get sheared, they have access to the barn because then their wool coat is gone. And so that's usually in early March because we lamb in April. I think that it saves equipment. All I can say is I just can tell you the years that I bale grazed with cows, and we would starting a tractor in January is like a crapshoot when it's -10. And I'm sure some of you have gelled tractors. I have. It's really great when you order a bunch of gas and they like mess up, like it's not the winter mix yet or whatever, stuff like that happens. And so this is really saved equipment. Wear and tear is setting out bales. Now you have to plan ahead. And so one of the things for me is that water is a huge issue. So I have some places where I have hydrants actually out in these fields, and then some places where I don't. And sheep have to trail to get to water. And that's obviously, trailing can be a big issue, can create mud. It's also not great for the animals to have to go very far. I have some places where I can drive water, like I can haul water, but those places are limited. So when I set up my bales, I have to be like, how long can I make it up this road with my gator before I can't make it because it's like driving a boat. So I do have to think about some of that stuff. I can obviously haul water with the tractor, but I've got to pay Chris to use a tractor. So it's actually been great. I think it was really annoying occasionally, but so not starting a tractor and not driving on the fields all the time has been huge. I would say I'm also pretty jacked from rolling bales. And I've learned a couple of really good things, which is that I don't set the bale on its end. I set the bales on their sides when they get set out. So then I can cut the plastic and literally roll it out of the plastic. If the bale is by this one guy who I buy hay from sometimes, they're so heavy that I can't roll them, I can tuck the plastic underneath. And then when they get down to the low part of the bale, I can usually pull it out. And so then they can't eat the plastic because I don't want them to eat plastic or netting. Or I don't want to go pick it up in the spring after it's blown everywhere. So that's one thing. The other thing is that bale feeders, what I've noticed is that this is a sheep bale feeder that works really great because it's in 6 panels. So that means I can unpin part of it and drag 3 sections at a time, or I can drag the whole thing like a big triangle so that back end's not catching on every hump. These are great because they do reduce waste, and they also keep my sheep from prolapsing their vagina. So one of the problems with sheep and bale grazing is when you set a bale on end, they tend to eat it in like a cone. Sorry, can you hear me? actually don't probably need this at all.
You do.
You
You actually do. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when you set it like a cone, they've got to stretch out and eat in. And this is something Yash and I have discussed a lot. I don't know if he's still here. But sheep should not be upright because the first thing that comes out is their vagina when they're like in this position. When you feed a bale inside, the hay rolls off and they are able to get to it. You don't end up with this cone of spikes like this in a bale. Right? It's also easier to pull it apart if it gets stuck in there, and you can roll it by hand. So those are a couple of reasons that we've seen. I actually couldn't find the picture. I have some pictures that show like the green spots on fields like the next year. It's literally the best pasture renovation tool I've seen. It also has seed in it, right? So you're fertilizing your pasture, mulching it and seeding it all at the same time. We don't mess around with anything after, we just leave it and it's been fine. It's pasture, so it's not like a perfectly flat hayfield anyway, but I'm always trying to think like, how can I not use the tractor? How can I not start the tractor? And we probably spend about $20 to $25 a day. It's not, or is that right? It's about 50 cents a sheep per day. So I think that was with the sheep flock that I have now. In the past, one thing that's great is if you can set up your bale so that you have them on a hill. So if you have a hill, use your hill. We would set all of our bales like on their sides, on the edge. And then if you had to roll out like 2 bales per day to feed your 80 cows or whatever, then we would just roll them down. And you can even roll them partway with the plastic on to get them a certain distance, as long as you don't let them get out of control. And then cut them and then open them up and roll them out. So I don't think I skipped some things, but
Can I ask you a quick question?
yeah,
Do your sheep pick up the plastic on the other bales?
that's a great question. So yes, and no. So you see how I have a net there?
Oh, I didn't see that.
Yeah, and actually, so I actually do fence off a lot of bales when I'm bale grazing. And I don't really care if they chew the plastic. I'm like 4 or 5. Net is a pain to move in the snow. It gets frozen in and it sucks.
Yeah.
I also sometimes I have different fields. So maybe I'll put 15 bales in this field, 10 bales in this field, 8 bales in that field. So then the high tensile is actually separating them, which I can leave on in the winter. And then if they pick 10 bales in January, I don't really care too much. Cows can be really difficult, but with cows, you can pound a hole in the ground, like with a logging spike, and then you can put a ring top in, and that's what we did in Colorado. So, okay, that's not what I want, actually. This is a hay pile grazing in Colorado, which is like Bale Grazing in Vermont. In that the hay has been put out and you're gonna graze so many bales per day or so many hay piles per day. And so to protect these piles, so the cows didn't go in and just eat them all at once or make a big mess and flip them all over, is that we would fence off and they would get like 12 or 20 per day. And so in that case, you would have a poly wire that went through there to keep them from picking or messing with your hay stock. And so that is super important. I don't know if anyone else has that.
So do I.
Oh, yeah, well, what?
I think the name of this panel is The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. So I'm the ugly, because when I started farming in 2017, 2018, I knew nothing. And so I actually put the cows out on a really nice pasture in my land and just kind of let them out there for a while. And I was growing really nice broadleaf plantain and clover, and all that went away in 1 year because of compaction. As I said, I'm on a downslope and they were out there, and then just next thing I had was knotweed, and I had a sedge, lots and lots of sedge. And so I consulted Amber and some others who will just not name them. Some said because of the soil moisture that I should just go away from cows was just not an option for my consumption habits and the kind of clientele that I had. And I started to try to bring back that pasture and also to address an area that's my main pasture, which has too much we've talked about canary grass, like the newer versions are better than the old versions. I think someone recommended the newer ones. The old version has less nutrients in it, not very good. And I was trying to replace it. This is Amber's recommendation this year. So I was trying to do that in part too, because I had a PASA Climate Smart grant coming. And then thank you, President Trump, but that all went away. I still have the spots where I was trying to replace that grass through bale grazing. Over the last few years, I have been doing bale grazing to try to get rid of the knotweed and get rid of the sedge. And I also worked with Amber to get a BMP grant that helped me recontour the land, move the water away from these problem areas, and create a real barnyard, which would allow me to contain the cows and not just let them out there. And one of the problems for me is the ways in which over the winter, and this winter was a good winter for really freezing the ground and allowing them to be out there eating around the bales. But in the past, it's been up and down. So it's hard to decide when to keep them in, when to put them out, and trying to get them back in is a pain in the butt. And that has something to do with my water source. So if they got to get to the water, then you got to keep it open. And so you're always watching the temperatures. And I think over the last 7, 8 years of farming, I've noticed that most years aren't like this year. And that leads to further compaction. And so my primary use of bale grazing was to really try to remedy the ugliness of my initial forays into farming.
It's okay, we've all been there. We're currently still there. The bale grazing context is not all for one and one for all. You can do a little or a lot. You can do it in different ways. I like you'd say bale grazing, but you could be, it's bale feeding. They're eating a bale of hay in some shape or form. You're deciding how you want to manage those bales. I was telling Josh yesterday that bale of hay represents fertility. So you can, if it's really bad, like super bad, I've rolled bales through the trees down into the thing for a few days. I have rolled them down big hills. I would caution, I let a bale of baleage go and I damn near killed a cow. They were looking at, oh, this is what's coming at me. Oh, look. And I want to generally, they kind of butt heads with that, roll it right over. I thought I killed the cow was down, beat her up, and I'm like, wow, that's $2,000 laying there, like flopping around. She got up, and I was like, oh. So then I've used feeders. There's individual feeders. I've used the slider feeder where you can put 2 or 3 bales because I have 50 cows. So I had the ones with the skis, another caution. I moved it ahead every day, except for that one time where it was a little icy, and then it clicked like that. And I watched 3 round bales full of baleage take off and go down the hill towards about 50 cows and going, oh man. And now we're talking about a $20,000 bill and somehow they all looked and said, holy shit, there's like coming at us, and they all scattered and it went right on by them. I'm like, didn't see that coming. So again, all these strategies of feeding. And when I was at Brett, has been bale grazing 25 years, I watched his farm on how he manages, and he places bales in all the fields, depending on what he wants out of those fields. He's preloading all these fields. So some bales have a lot of bales, some have a few, some are in the woods. I watched the deer, they were like, sweet. He lays them in the silvopastures for different things, for different folks. So he's on the road a lot. So he can, if the weather's bad, he turns them here. They're very, very flexible. That was one of our questions to the panel here is how do you manage this bale grazing context with static bales, delivering the feed with portable fence, or just turning them into big bales and leaving them there for a few days? That's one of the questions I feel like everyone wanted to know. How do you manage?
Adaptively, that's the answer to that question. Now, for me, with the pregnant beef cow, those are dry first cut hay, set out, and they get 3 days access at a time. First day they fill up, second day they're just chilling, third day is a cleanup day. And 4 days, they're usually mad by day 3, and day 4, they're really mad. They want fresh stuff because what they have is gotten soiled basically from them laying on it. So 3 days seems to be the magic number for me. If you could do 2 days, but they don't clean it up as well. So that third day helps just to clean up the excess so they're not wasting.
So you say 3 days for how many cows? Like
it doesn't matter, whatever size group it is. So if you 3 days, allocate 3 days worth of hay to whatever size group it is. Whether to use feeders or not, that's, for me, we don't do it with the cheaper first cut dry hay. Like I said, anything under $115 a ton. and pushing those cows to clean it up, you're not having that much waste. I figure about 7% waste if the ground is frozen on that deal. That's pretty good. Now, when we do it with feeder calves, which we try not to, but if we do, those ones we do put that feed in the feeder. So baleage, if you're talking second and third cut baleage, that's $150 to $200 a ton. That is definitely going in a feeder and trying to get as minimal feed waste as possible from a financial standpoint. And at that point, you're relying on the manure and the urine to do any soil amendment, basically, come spring. So as far as technically how we do it, like I said, we use a tractor and a wagon to haul bales out. And we'll haul hay for the afternoon. We'll pick a day when the going is really good, when the roads are, when it's not icy, when you can just get to where you're going. And I'll set it like, when I say bale grazing, we're using like the back 100 acres of the property. So if a property's, we're truck it a mile back off of the road, back into the one farm where we do a lot of bale grazing to get that fertility way back there, because it was hauled out as hay for 40 years. So now we're hauling it back in essentially. So technically we haul it, we set the bales, flip them on their flat side, and we peel all the plastic off the day and we move them. If you don't peel the plastic off of those, if you pick them up, that bottom is wet. And if it's cold, that net wrap is frozen on there forever. Basically, you will not get the net wrap off. So you gotta peel the net, take all the plastic off the day you touch it. And then we move the cows to the bales. That's how I do it. We've done polywire, like setting a big grid pattern, 50-foot spacing, and going through our pastures, our properties are all divided. There's about 16 permanent paddocks roughly on each property. And so sometimes we decide we want to focus on one paddock and we'll put 200 round bales out there and then try and use polywire to get through that. That works really good until you get an ice storm overnight. And ice storm knocks out your polywire and the cows are moving ahead. When we do that, it's just like management intensive grazing where we always have a second reel ahead of the cows. So even if they get through to make tomorrow the next batch of hay, they aren't in all 2-tiered bales because that's almost impossible to get them back out of, and they've destroyed the bales ahead of you.
Nope.
Yeah, I don't know how a battery works in negative 10-degree weather, but so if we're using polywire, it's definitely Gallagher reels and O'Brien tread-in posts, and we can put those in the ground until it's like 12 below zero on bare frozen ground without any drills or hammers or anything. Again, my new favorite is to just park the polywire for the winter, and we just set the bales out in each permanent paddock, and we move the cows to the bale. Then it's only just opening a gate. Anybody can open the gate. If I want to be gone, somebody else can move the cows to fresh feed every day if we need to. So that's like my real technical. And then it's always just keeping it flexible, and there's absolutely no recipe to bale grazing. If I can drive home one part today, there's no recipe to bale grazing. It is very adaptive all the time. We try to, when things are really good, you can set out hay like, I don't want hay set out more than 3 weeks in advance personally. I can watch the long range weather and know where we're going to be and where we should be and see if there's any big major warm-ups. If it looks like it's going to be really cold and hard for the foreseeable future, we'll bale graze on low wet ground. But we don't want our hay there and have to be there if it's going to warm up to 40 and be in the mud. So when it's muddy and wet, we want to be up on higher ground if we can. So just setting it all out in the fall would be great, and we do set some, but it's just one of those tasks that never gets done. And that's my main big points on the how-to.
One thing I was thinking of is the bales that you use matter a lot. Obviously, if you have a super wet bale that then gets frozen to this block, even if you try to unroll it off the hill, then you end up playing candle pinball with your cows. So one thing I have learned is that the hay that I use, because we do try to set all of our hay out at once in the fall and like plan way ahead, is that there's certain hay I can't put out like that because I can't physically roll a bale like that. Or if I decide not to roll it and I just tuck the plastic or whatever, then it's like a cleanup that's annoying later. I would say that like with cattle, we had a lot of luck actually just rolling the bales fully. And one thing we did is when it was going to be like a big snow or in the middle of a big snow, we would roll out shitty bales basically as bedding for them to lay in, depending on the cover. So one thing we also do is I think about the farm and the landscape I have to bale graze in, and like I plan to like in January bale graze in a field that has some big pines in it, so they have really good cover in there. And then if I'm bale grazing in November, I don't really care so much about cover. They can be in a big open field with no cover because it doesn't tend to be as nasty as January. I also know that if I'm gonna bale graze a wetter field, I save that one for like February when it should be frozen. But some years it isn't. This year we had a great year for bale grazing. I think one thing is we talked about protecting your bale. Like in the picture here, you can see how I put the netted to protect some bales. I also use that to protect my grass. So if I'm bale grazing in late fall or something, or in a really crappy pasture to like kill a certain kind of grass, fertilize the bales, and then hopefully replant something better. If you're trying to kill something specifically, you can just let them have the whole field and they're going to eat all of the grass that's there down to nothing and then eat your bales. So that can really suck if it's in a good field, right? In the winter, it doesn't really matter if there's a good snow cover because they can't really get down. And so they're not going to damage like a nice, good quality field or when you've already improved bale grazing. So it's really important that you can find them when there's no snow cover. Right, that's like really key because they will eat everything. One thing you can also do is, so this, I couldn't find any other picture like this, but when you're bale grazing animals that are like a higher quality animal, not like a dry cow, but like feeder cows, because I do this with sheep or lambs that are going to be butchered in like a month or two. I do bale graze them as long as they have really good cover, but you can supplement them with something. So this is like a slide of there's cows that are grazing and they're being supplemented with fancy oat hay off the back of that trailer. So you can like literally feed 5% or 10% of their feed in something that's higher quality to help if you have first cut bales or something. Some people use cubes and that's maybe not as common on the East Coast, but it is a little easier to handle off of cubes or something like that. One thing I was going to say about bale rings is we used to use those big metal bale rings for bale cows, which really sucked because when you slam them down, all the bolts fall out and the thing just falls open. Because if you're like rolling around like a hamster wheel by hand or something crazy, or you're trying to like lower them by hanging off the back like a sailboat to go down over a bale, you can, these are something that I saw, I can't remember the guy's name, actually maybe he remembers, he's here. Who is this?
Oh, Ed Jackson?
Yeah, Ed had these and I was like, oh my God, I wish I'd had these 10 years ago. These are like plastic, I think a century, and they're like plastic, they're lighter, and they're just a lot more mobile. So I do think if you're gonna use feeders, the feeder you use matters. I got totally sidetracked.
My one trouble with feeders is if you're trying to like move across a wide landscape or from one 30-acre field to another 30-acre field, you have to go back and get all your rings before you move your cow's head. I think, like I said, 7% waste sounds pretty good to me, rather than messing around with feeders. That's my personal opinion.
That's your question, Josh?
Yeah, sorry, I missed you before.
No worries, Josh. I've asked you a million questions since I started. Josh is one of the best cow calf guys I think in the state, so just gonna throw that out there. But thank you for everything. I had this bale ring conversation with you before the past. And is there a reason that you just haven't getting the Greg Judy bale unroller? Is it just because you can't get it? Is it because you don't like it? Or what are your thoughts there?
I used to unroll hay,
Yeah.
like manually. I was 21 when I started, so I manually brought the hay up. But the problem is if you get a deep snow, you're into plowing snow.
Yeah, okay.
So then we had a really snowy winter and I spent like all winter in the tractor plowing feed grounds.
Yeah.
And that's when I was like, this is the waste.
Right.
So because we're burning way more diesel fuel and way more tractor time just to go out there and feed every single day. So if you unroll it, you really need to feed daily or close to it. Or else if you're feeding a lot of them, they're going to weigh on a lot more of it, isn't my mindset on it. So I like just setting the bales out and giving them the 3 day, back to the 3 day thing. That also gives them a lot of feed space. So your dominant cow doesn't come through and knock all those smaller timid cows out. So we have bred heifers running over mature cows. And there's a significant size difference. There's 400 pounds of difference there. And so by setting, like say a group of 60 cows goes into 3 days worth would be like 9 bales. Versus 2 days worth, they'd only be going on 6 bales. So there's significantly more bunk space, if you will, by going to that 3 day arc.
That 3 day thing, that's a paradigm shift, Josh. Thank you.
I think we don't have to repeat everything, so I'm not gonna repeat everything. A lot of the practices that are shared here, things that I do. But I will focus on the 3 day. I do 3 day as well, but I use a ring. And the reason I'm using a ring, and we'll see if it actually works. It seems to be improving my field, but I was trying to revive a pasture that had been beaten out, compacted, and poor growth. What I do in the first day is I surround that ring with, I spread seed. And so what happens is the cows, as they're feeding, they're crushing that seed into the ground. And in theory, that will then come back in the spring as new grass. I know that the attrition rate is bad, but from where I was, this is going to be an improvement. And then on the third day, or really this end of the second day, I'll lift that ring and then I'll let them just really have at it and eat it down to the ground and use it for bedding if they wish, and prepare my next one. I don't roll out my bales except for a few in the fall. Just it's the scale that I'm operating at. And I actually do prefer to drive out there on the hard frozen ground. And I have a tractor that can allow for that. And the other reason I don't put them out in advance is because my cows do pick at the plastic. They do tip them, or if they're on their side, definitely don't put them on their sides because they'll just roll them into my fence. And so it's just not ideal for cows. I think that's the big difference between cows and sheep. Yeah, and let's keep it moving.
I have one actually additionally. Sorry. One thing I was gonna say about rolling bales is that I did have really good luck. This is 10 years ago when I had a big group of cows and I only could roll them out in this field that was on a hill. And I did set them out on their sides, but I set them on their sides like this way so you can just push on the bale and turn it and then roll it down the hill. And I did actually put a poly wire in front, but I made the poly wire so I didn't have to move any posts. It was like a stack, literally. So I could lay the wire down, roll the bale over the top of it, and then it worked great. And I was feeding like the exact 2 bales a day because it's a big herd of cows. So 2 bales a day, and being aware that start to peel it off a little bit before you start it if it's frozen, because then it will be like this giant block. And I have rolled a bale over myself once and I lived through it like the cow. It was actually more painful than I thought it would be. But anyway, so do be careful.
On purpose, didn't we, Jen?
We did do it on purpose.
Yeah, we did. I just had a quick story about context, and this is not an all or nothing type of thing. You can do all kinds of things with those bales. My grazing partner he had a trip planned to Nashville this last summer, or a month or two ago. And he's a bale roller. He made his own unroller, Greg Judy, whatever. He looked at Greg, his father's a great welder. They made it for little or nothing. He loves rolling bales. That's his context. He's the bale roller. So I said, he told me that to feed all these cows, it's going to take his brother 3 hours a day while he's gone. And I said, in that time frame, you think he was gone 5 days. If you just planted these bales in a grid, like these folks are talking about, you don't need him there. You can pop in with a truck and look, make sure there's water, and then move on. So I don't do that. I roll. I'm a roller. I'm like, I'd love for you to change your paradigm. Would you place enough bales? It's not for my decision. I tried. But when we talk about techniques and why you do stuff, again, use it to your advantage. And part of, hopefully all of us in the winter, we're going to go someplace warm for a little while, maybe, or maybe you want to go on a ski trip, or you just want to get away from it. Placing those bales where there's no tractors and no labor you can do that for a week. You could do it for a couple weeks. You could do it while it's frozen, then move to another system when it's not frozen. You can do all kinds of different things depending on exactly what you want to do. When there's too much snow, it's harder, even on big hills, it's still hard to roll, get that thing going. I tend to like to do that when the ground, when the snow was more fluffy than whatever. And then I roll some bales because we want to do some sliding with my grandchildren, and I might just let the bale go and not do anything with it. Just let it roll down the hill and make a path for the sliding. So there's a ton of things you can do with these round bales. They're super fun. That, again, as much as imagination, you can use this practice or this tool to get what you want. So I think it's probably a good segue to talk about maybe watering infrastructure. Maybe we could go into maybe with watering, infrastructure in general and maybe animal welfare, because I've been called in for, let's see. So the cows were on a kind of a main road and somebody called the troopers and said, the farmer there is starving his animals. They're grazing stockpile. There's snow out there. There's this much snow. They're grazing. So the trooper had me over there and we talked a minute and I said, I have to educate, make sure I'm not in trouble. You fall off the thing, there's this much orchard grass. The cows are like, yeah, I don't know what. Anyway, animal welfare wise, I had to bring hay over there, place it in some kind of grid pattern so the people driving by could see that they had feed. In that time frame, it was a couple of weeks there. It was really beautiful grazing weather. It was frozen. There was lots of stockpile. They didn't even eat the hay, but the hay was there. And so people think that they're getting fed by the hay. You're not getting a call. So that animal welfare, and then of course we can all, I think it's something to address when we're talking about having animals out on the landscape and these unfamiliar weather events, and then the drive-by, oh, well, you know, you're supposed to have them in a farm. People tell us how to farm. So maybe you could address the infrastructure, the watering, and maybe a little animal welfare.
Yeah, like I said, for infrastructure, we're not using anything that we didn't have already. Permanent divider fences, some poly wire here and there, but like I said, we phased that out, mostly because I'm getting old and lazy. So it's a lot easier just to use the fence that we have. So infrastructure, water wise, we have, I have a picture of it here, I should have, but we have a rubber tire tank that's gravity fed from a spring up higher than it. And then there's an overflow pipe in that tank. That's centrally located on that property. So the property that I'm talking about is like 250 acres of pasture. And it's pretty centrally located with some sort of laneways, corridors going to it. So that runs all winter long and rarely freezes if it's allowed to overflow. But we also there's some armored crossings where there's stream crossings and where they have access there. They have to walk across the armored crossing to get back to the water tank anyways. A lot of times cows are more lazy than me and they will stop there and drink and not walk all the way to the top, believe it or not. And then also, we're not frozen a lot of times, and a lot of times there's just some surface water in the pasture, and we really don't need a lot of water in the wintertime. Heat is what makes the cow really need. Heat or lactation is what makes the cow really need a lot of water. When we're like winter grazing and there's snow on the ground, they don't walk anywhere. They just eat snow. They always have access to water, but they don't need, is what I'm saying. The only thing that walks to the water tank's a lot of things. As far as infrastructure, that's basically it. I think that's where I really like about Bale Grazing is it fits into a grazing system really well. You're using what you already have without spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on other feeding systems. Oh, animal welfare. Yeah, we don't do it next to the road most of the time. It's not that we're trying to hide it, it's just we don't want the aggravation of it. Our cows are on 22A, especially in the wintertime. Like Friday afternoon, it's all New Jersey and New York plates. Sunday afternoon, they're all going home. They all come by to go skiing on weekends. The local population's not too much trouble, but there's always feed in front of them. That's the good thing with Bale Grazing is it's not, winter grazing is where I worry. Like Troy's story, that's where I worry more about the animal welfare side of it and getting called in. Luckily, we've never been called in, but we do, it's like anything. You gotta be adaptive. You watch the weather. If there's a big blizzard coming in, you better have some feed in the trees where they can get away from it all. If we have had them be out where they could have gotten out of the weather, but they chose not to, or they just bunch up. Cows will bunch like buffalo did, they're shoulder to shoulder. And you'll come in and there'll be an area the size of this room and there's just piles of manure, 50, 60, 100 cows just bunched up for 24 hours in a row out of the blizzard. Generally, if they're pregnant cows, there's generally going to be a fetus or two laying on the ground after that, though, if they're that stressed from the weather. So you'll have some abortions in that deal. So that's something to seriously think about. Getting them to actually move off the bales is something they don't want to always do. If you're in the set grid and you've got 200 bales ahead of them and you've been moving east, and now you want to go west half a mile to get into the trees they just won't follow you. They won't leave. So you're either pushing them or they're going to stay where they're at and hopefully that's. But for the most part, there's very little. A healthy cow that's outside and she's clean, she's got a good healthy hair coat. Snow's piling up on her back. They don't even know it.
Yeah, I think I mentioned already that we're just strategic about pine trees. Honestly, she'd have quite the coat, so I also don't worry about it that much. Freezing rain is actually probably the worst thing for animals. And if we would have, I think this winter we actually had, I think we had a couple days of freezing rain, and I actually just ran my sheep to a place that had a bunch of big pine trees because that can be really tricky. Like I agree, cold and snow is not so bad, but freezing rain can be dangerous. What else were we talking about?
Welfare.
Well, no, I
Got that.
got that.
And infrastructure.
Oh, water. Oh my God. Yeah, so I love that you guys, what you brought up the overflow tanks because in like really primitive settings, those are awesome because then you don't have to excavate basically to put in a frost-free water or hydrant. Instead, you can have an overflow system. The key is though his overflow pipe so that he doesn't have a mud hole in the middle of his pasture his cows are slipping and sliding on because ponds are super dangerous. And definitely having your cows drinking out of a brook that's not armored is not good. For one thing, it's bad for water quality because they're doing a lot of crapping in the brook. And also they can really slip and slide and hurt themselves. So I've seen that or people who've had to go over the bank and get their dead cow out of the brook or it gets in the muddy brook and so forth. Obviously, like hauling water in the winter is hard. One thing is if you do haul is you have to protect the valve. Just like a fire truck, it has to have a protection on it so the valve doesn't freeze. So even if you have this big tank of water and your valve is frozen, you better have a heat gun on you or a torch and then you melt all your stuff. So that's like another consideration. I think I'm running out of, I think you've heard so many topics, good questions.
So I use the resources that I have all year round. Unfortunately, again, this is a celebration of Amber's ingenuity. She also helped me get a PSWF grant, which allowed me to put in a water in my barnyard, which was built with the BMP. So,
You just say what that is.
oh gosh, you want me to spell out BS? Go ahead.
Pasture surface water and fencing or best management practices. There's people that so.
Yeah, these are Vermont grants. And it took me 3.5 years of failure until, actually it was 2.5, and then Amber helped me crack the nut. So not to put too much pressure on you, but she was really important.
I'm here to help you guys.
Yeah, and now the water is there for them to come and go from the bales. And then I use the fencing that I have. The only trouble is that one space way out on the pasture that I'm trying to beat down the old canary, the reed canary grass. It's across the channel now, the swale that was built. And the thing is about, like we've already said it, in the wintertime, cows don't drink that much water. And when there's a lot of snow out there, they're fine, I found. But they like to be closer to the barn because the weather is always changing. And especially if you have a bull has thinner hair, thinner skin, I found, and wants to be in the barn while the ladies are out. So sometimes he's an anchor that pulls them back. So I think I'm going to have uneven results from my Bale Grazing. Really good in the kind of 2 acres close to the barn, but not as good on the 6 to 7 acres out away across from the swale. And that's a condition of the water. I'm at a scale that I don't worry about that so much. Josh is at a scale that he has to worry about it. I have the fortune of not worrying about it. And then animal welfare, I'm right on 113. And yet I've never had someone complain about my treatment of my animals. What can I say? I know when I do on-farm slaughtering, and so when the itinerant slaughter comes to the farm, he tells many tales of people living in the same condition as me, complaining about just the regular folks on the highway calling in and complaining. I found that's more of a problem during the summertime with shade, but not in the wintertime with bale grazing.
The reason I brought the watering is always a question in these systems. The other part is a lot of you are grazing longer. So when you develop a grazing plan with your farm, for your farm with your partners, I'm always asking, so how long do you think you want to graze till? And if you're going to graze those extra acres somewhere, can we plan in an extra water? And if that water you're going to put somewhere away that is going to be for stockpiling, make it a winter water if you can. So I don't know, I put in all kinds of tanks. There's all kinds of fun stuff that are designed and things, but probably 10 years ago, we never thought about that much extension of grazing season was from May till middle of October, whatever it is. And then we're like, now we have people grazing till Christmas. So there's a whole nother in the agency world of saying, hey, we need some winter water. We don't need a ton of it. We would need some strategic places. And then, of course, there's a lot of farms that I'm familiar with that have cropland that is adjacent to pasture land, like corn ground or whatever, and having something strategic so you could raise cover crops. Again, they need some watering. So again, being strategic, that planning process has really ramped up since several years ago when we weren't even really talking about bale grazing, or stockpile grazing was just something all other people did. But there's a lot of people doing that now. So did you have some?
I was hoping I had a picture of my winter water on there, but I didn't put it on.
Oh, okay.
I skipped right by it.
I think, are you ready? You could ask questions anytime you want.
Can we talk about the bad real quick?
We could talk about the bed. I mean,
Because
there's
it's not all sunny and roses.
correct. If you want to go down that path, I'm here to.
Best stories.
So the bad, the mud, the ugly, so then we can all like, lament, and then then you're gonna have to do the good part, lift us up, our spirits.
It's a
And
standard.
yeah,
Bad.
and then we have questions. I see people like, you better answer them. So let's go down that path and then bring the questions.
I think the obvious is mud is the biggest. Like my farm is all 100% clay, so there is no bottom and there is nothing firm. There's nothing but clay and sloping clay too. So you have serious concerns about erosion, not necessarily deep erosion, but like large amounts of soil moving around if you're on a hill slope. The other thing to think about is also nutrients running off with the snow. Bale placement, that's one of the main things that I'm thinking about when I place bales, is that we're in an area that's not directly next to a waterway that's going to shed directly into a waterway when that snow melts. That is one really nice thing about getting the bales set before the snow. For some reason, they're already down to the ground, and a lot of that seems to stay better versus like snow. If you have snow, you set hay on top of it. Hay works as an insulator, holds all that snow underneath, then your snow and your manure, or your hay and your manure is above the snow, and as it all melts, it's all kind of melting in together. But I didn't say that directly. But anyway, so some of the bad winters that aren't frozen, like last winter and the previous winter, our ground did not freeze. We didn't have frost one time to where you could drive a tractor across the ground. So this was this winter. This is the day Megan asked me to do this, just took pictures. This is what it looks like when it's pretty. And it's right. That's about what I'm looking for when we're done, is mostly just manure left behind, not a lot of it. That's everybody grazing. This is last year, going in and out of a piece, just through a gateway. We were using snow to hold the tractor and wagon up, basically, and just trying to avoid the wet spots that we knew were there and stick to the driest parts to still get out. And then we just made sacrifice areas. We were bale grazing over areas that were bale grazed. We basically loaded up, grazed it off, loaded up, grazed it off, and just kept doing that to minimize the damage, because you don't want to destroy your entire farm doing this if it's wet. So focus, sacrifice areas if you're gonna do it as far as things going bad. That's when it looks good. That's hay unrolled with a big group, basically. If you come out, so if you don't have hay set out, you can't set your 3 days worth of hay. You can't set it fast enough for a group that size. You need to unroll it so they can all start eating when you show up. But, so it's just like grazing. I prefer to have the next set ready to go just 1 gate away. But every once in a while we gotta unroll it. That's winter grazing, which is a much more preferred method of feeding cows through winter, in my opinion. I just wanted to throw that in there. So yeah, mud management is the biggest drawback for this. It is doable, but it's just less efficient. We see probably closer to a 25% waste. When I say waste, I don't mean waste, because I call it that's left for the underground livestock. But so you're not going to see the utilization of your feed when it's muddy, but they will stand on it.
Are you making an adjustment to your expectations for that field with immediately following in terms of your grazing plan?
Yeah.
And what kind of,
A lot of that will be skip the first rotation in the grazing system, and then we'll come back in like August when it's dry and hit it. And it's gonna be a lot of broadleaf weeds. Whenever you put that much nutrients in one area, broadleaf weeds are not unexpected. That's your potassium being released from the soil, which is a good thing. But you just see those weeds. It's just like when somebody does tillage, they get a lot of broadleaf weeds. That's the potassium release. So if we really mess it up, we'll skip it the first time. But most of it, when it's light and it's done nicely, they just graze over it and their feet actually help disturb that thatch that's left.
One thing actually that's nice about a field being bale graze is that it's like creating a grazing wedge, but without grazing, like during the grazing season. So that's not a good description. Okay, so you know how when you go out and you always feel like you should have started grazing a week earlier than you did because orchard grass is like heading at you. Crap, that's 20 days away, too late. So if you bale graze, a lot of times you can plan to graze the fields that you bale graze later in your first rotation, so they're not as overgrown because they're going to be set back from either the cows grazing around or the bales and the effect of trampling and disturbance. So it can actually be a nice way to slow down your first rotation's growth so that by the time you get there, it's actually still not totally overgrown yet. So it's not perfect, right? Nothing's perfect in Vermont. It's like there's always the paddocks you hit and they're perfect, which is why you should never graze your farm in the same exact pattern. So we should always change things up, which is also why you shouldn't bale graze. If you can change up where you bale graze every year, that's great. And then you're hitting more fields with fertility. One thing I did bring with me was this awesome article that came out called The 5 Commandments for Bale Grazing in the East, and it came out of Kentucky. And I hate to tell you guys this, but with climate change, we might be like Kentucky someday. And so thinking about what it's going to be like bale grazing in 20 years is a lot different than bale grazing now. And they have some really great points here. Like one of the things they say in Kentucky is that you shouldn't feed more than 2 tons of hay per acre in any section. So obviously, depending on what your goals are, like your goal might be to hammer a field with hay, fertilize it really well and renovate it, or you're just lightly bale grazing, right? So you're going to put out different amounts of hay accordingly. This article also says don't allow unfettered access to pasture when the snow isn't covered. And that's what I was talking about, like fencing off areas. I'm just going to read them because it's actually really good. Don't set out hay piecemeal. Have a plan and set it out like accordingly. I've actually had set out a little too much hay because I set it in the fall and then I had to go get it, but I had to wait until it's dried or frozen and hard because I'm so petrified of having muddy ruts, which I have had before, especially when I was grazing a lot of cows. But I've also got a tractor stuck doing that. So that's part of the reason that I really try to set everything out at once, which then you have a plastic you have to deal with. So you guys don't have to deal with plastic, which is nice, especially with wetter bales. But the upside of plastic is if you set bales out that you never use, they're not ruined. You can use them, you can move them and get them later. It says do not bale graze the same pasture more than once a winter. And I think for me, that seems obvious. Like you wouldn't bale graze something and then go back 2 months later and bale graze it again because you've already done it. And then the last part is don't let the cattle go hungry. So obviously like letting them clean up, and he has a system that really works great for him. One thing is if you have trees and pastures where you're bale grazing, we didn't really talk about this yet. They hammer the trees, they chew the bark, they eat every bush. So if your goal is for them to eat invasive bushes, that's awesome. However, if you have trees in those fields, a lot of times they will really chew those trees to death. So you need to protect those or fence them out or whatever. So that is something I think is a concern. So if your goal is agroforestry and you're planning to bale graze some of those fields, you need to protect those trees that you planted really adequately, even if they're really mature trees.
Okay, and it's great to be the last one because I don't have to repeat everything. So I can just pinpoint the thing that's, I would say ugly for me is as we exit the bale grazing season and we're in the spring, sometimes because of warming and I got to get the cows off, I'd rather have them off than compact in the soil. They don't finish the entire bale. And so what's left behind, sometimes they also use it as a bed. And so then I worry about the grass growth below and trying to spread that remainder of the hay on the field. That's something I'm thinking about right now because I have some parts that are less eaten than others. Josh's picture is beautiful when it's eaten down and you just see the manure and all, but oftentimes it's not that pretty and you have to figure out how to do it. So it's a question to you, what you guys do. I often go out there with a fork and try to spread it around to create some air and some light for the grass below, but it's imperfect. It's also a time when the soils are really wet, so you don't want to put a tractor out there. So I'm out there just like by hand on foot with fork spreading all hay, and I hate it, and it's bad on my back, and it's really ugly.
Don't do it.
So I just asked Josh quick about, so this is where that mud and all that, I hate mud. I hate my pastures getting plugged up, but that's why I keep calling it perpetual November until it isn't. It's always perpetual November till it ain't. Then you revel in the frozen concrete you get. My answer to mud is concrete or some hardened pad that we've developed. I've inherited barns, so I only use a barn like in March, like between the mud, like when I can't handle it anymore, my mind is shot and I'm stressed out. I just put them in a yard for 20 days or whatever. I can't afford to build a barn. If I had to buy new, I can't afford it to use it for a month. But any hardened area I've copied, not anything I'm not that smart. I copy people that do good stuff. So a lot of my work at our farm comes from Minnesota. So they have lots of bark bed yards that have no roofs. They bed it real heavy. They only use it for a certain amount of time. It's just like rotational grazing. You only use it for a specific purpose to hold them there. And then you go back to grazing or when the conditions are right. So in this climate, weird stuff, it's hard to justify the price of these things if you're a full-on holistic kind of planned grazing thing for 1 month of really crappy weather, maybe 2, and the rest of the time you're on pasture, it doesn't really pencil out. But so there's other alternatives that we could use shelter belts, and those you can do some plantings and other things to relieve some of the mud concerns and get them in a sacrifice place. And then you can collect that manure, obviously, which is super important to get back on the land. So again, that is always in our framework of what's after mud or what's during mud. How do I get away from the mud? It's just another tool if you have it. Now, Josh, I don't know if he said anything, but there's also people that have barns and pads around that are retired, or there's corn stubble that you can make that mud. They're going to plow it up anyway, right? My neighbors don't have cows. They have to be convinced they want cows again. There's no fences, but I keep looking out. I'm going home. I'm going back where I came from. And when I go from here to the Crown Point Bridge, I'm going to see a ton of land that could maybe have some animals in I saw some barns that were uninhabited that could be used for a 30-day period. It wasn't like you're going to keep them there. There's a lot of resources locally and opportunities. It's just going to take a little bit of how bad do I want it? 20 days, 30 days would make a big difference. You said your neighbor.
Yeah, we loaded our cows Saturday and put them in a dairy barn. So they'll be there for 45 days, or the brood cows. So we don't have to make mud this year.
So
Just find an empty pen somewhere. There's a lot of empty dairy barns, but yeah.
When Josh told me that, he went from like neutral to like this. Like what? 45 days? Oh, nice. And we're both going, yeah, that's good. But it takes relationships, connection. There's a lot of opportunities. It's just that maybe those folks don't know we need only a short-term window. Like they don't want cows for that long, but for 30 days there's a lot of free concrete around. It's just like, how do you manage? I saw a hand somewhere. Yes, John.
Yeah, the 2 tons and the 5 rules. 2 tons of hay per acre,
It's not very much.
but it looks like you had way more than that.
Yeah.
I don't know that I agree with that. We
Well,
agree.
so this is what they're doing in Kentucky. This is not what I'm saying that we should do right now or anything. But if you're in a super, like I bet on the fields that you have that are wetter, you can probably put less hay bales.
Yeah, in my mind, it would help spread your nutrients farther. That is one limiting constraint to bale grazing. If you try and do 50-foot grids, you're only going to cover 5 acres during winter. Versus if you only put a little bit and you scatter it farther, you're spreading those nutrients that are then going to be recycled through the cow and recycled across the pasture. So it would, in my mind, from a nutrient standpoint, help spread it farther rather than pollute one piece of ground, which you certainly can put too much on one, and it's just too much. The system can't handle it.
This is for where it's 40 degrees most of the winter. I really hope it doesn't end up like Kentucky in Vermont someday, but I also have a really sandy farm. So I have a very forgiving farm for Bale Grazing because I'm on the Connecticut, right? So we're on a pile of sand. However, during a drought, things are pretty crispy. But there are places that you shouldn't Bale graze. And I'm really glad that we talked about dry lotting because having a sacrifice or not a sacrifice field necessarily, but like a dry lot and something like that is a huge plus. Also, like last summer when we had 8 inches of rain in one night in Barnet, Peachum and St. Johnsbury, those are the nights that you need to think about where to put your animals so they're safe and so that you're not going to just wreck like whatever field they're in.
Another question? Got 5 more minutes.
You got 3 more minutes.
Okay, great. One more question.
Recovery from hugging, like condition of the pasture going into the winter and coming out of it. Notice any trends of which pasture or that recovery? Like I'm thinking like dense root. I don't know. Just wondering if you've had any specific observations around recovery of just not the field.
So I think, like I told Troy yesterday, the cows, yes, they do compact the surface, but that's very high level compaction versus the tractor is driving that compaction 10, 12, 15 inches down. A cow is only going to compact the upper 4 inches. If you get some good freeze thaw in the spring, that's pretty much almost enough kind of help forgive that compaction that happens. So it's just like a grazing season, when we don't freeze in the winter, we see poor grass the next year is because we didn't get that freeze thaw to help undo our compaction. We're on clay and most of it's flat and we get compaction. There is no getting around it. When you get 8 inches of rain, there's going to be some compaction. We see it recover really well. That's, I guess, when I want to end on a high note of this, but in this picture, those posts are the same size. The one on the left is where there was bale graze. It was bale graze 2 years prior. And the one on the right, this ground had been sitting idle for 4 or 5 years anyways, maybe 10. And then we went in, fenced it and bale grazed it. And we just lit that system. Just the biology that happens with it is amazing. That is what really, you're feeding that biology, like massive amounts. It's like dropping buffet for earthworms and nematodes and everything else. And so you can see some substantial growth down the road.
Yeah, just gave me nutrition stewardship program related to implementing bale or swap grazing to increasing organic matter and nutrient and reducing nutrients in surface water. So that's a prescribed grazing thing that's happening in Vermont with the paving system. So I have a copy of that and hopefully I can get you a website about it, but I don't know much about it.
Let's give these young people a hand. We'll move on.